across South and Southeast Asia for climate change. He will talk about internal carbon pricing. And lastly, but definitely not the least, is Fong Ling Chin, who is Consulting Director leading Corporate Sustainability and Climate Change Services for Malaysia. She will talk more about Malaysia market and what to expect for organizations in the market going forward in terms of climate change. Let's move to the next slide with our key objectives for today. Through today's session, we hope to introduce to you what are the existing global and domestic carbon pricing instruments available in Malaysia. We'll talk about the future developments in Malaysian market again and what to expect and what to prepare for. And finally, we'll talk about the role of the internal carbon pricing and how it can help organizations better prepare for climate change and future net zero ambitions. And lastly, this is our agenda for today on the next slide. We will have two sessions. And we can move to the next slide with agenda, please. So we'll have two sessions. The first session will be more about global trends and landscape, including some examples of your peers, what they are already doing across the region. And once again, the focus will be on the global carbon pricing mechanisms, as well as what is already available in the ASEAN countries and how companies are already introducing internal carbon pricing. Whereas session two, led by Chin, will be more focusing on Malaysian market. As mentioned by Alex, we will save all the questions till the end. But in the meantime, if you have some, please do post them in the chat box. And maybe during the sessions, we will be already addressing them in writing for your clarity. With that, let's move on. And Alex has very kindly already introduced the RAM. I will just mention that we have just celebrated our 50-year anniversary. I honestly believe that ERM is truly the longest standing pure play sustainability consulting firm globally. And what really differentiates us is that we work with our clients across all sectors from what we call boots to boardroom, meaning that we know a lot from the on the ground projects around sustainability and climate change, but we also work a lot at the strategic level, helping organizations develop climate and ESG strategies, action plans, roadmaps, and define targets. Let's move straight to session one with that, and we will talk about the carbon pricing, what it is and how that may impact different organizations. So speaking in the formal definitions, carbon pricing is an instrument that captures the external cost of greenhouse gas emissions and tie them up to the sources of such emissions through a price. And typically, carbon pricing comes in two main forms, either as the carbon price or emission trading, which we will discuss in the next slides. So in short, that's a mechanism to put an additional price on emissions of greenhouse gases. This is not a new concept. In fact, that was introduced back in 1970s by the United States. And first it was applied for the air pollutants before it then expanded to greenhouse gases and the climate change topic. And it's an interesting market instrument where you really encourage the polluter or oblige the polluter to pay for the related emissions, whereas incentivizing low carbon and environmentally friendly practices at the same time. On the next slide, you will see why carbon pricing is an effective instrument. From the business perspective, it first of all sends a very clear signal from the government that going on, environmentally friendly practices are becoming in favor, whereas activities that lead to greenhouse gas emissions will be penalized, so that you can actually prioritize your investments in turn. From the government perspective, it's also a policy tool to manage greenhouse gas emissions at the country level or at the city level, depending on the geographical scope of this mechanism. Finally, what is probably most interesting to you as the financial sector, from the investor perspective, that also creates very clear financial signal or like a financial instrument for you to assess the future investments. And again, those areas of investment that are falling under the carbon pricing regulation would likely become less economically attractive because of this additional carbon price attached to it. As I mentioned on the next slide, we will see that there are two main forms of carbon pricing. The first form is the emission trading scheme, or sometimes also referred to as cap and trade system. What it means is that there is a certain cap that is allocated to industries or to facilities or to organizations within certain geographical boundary. And if those participants actually exceed the allocated cap, they would either need to uh, buy the offsets from others who manage to reduce their emissions better, or even outside of this scheme. Otherwise, you would need to pay a tax. In case of carbon tax, the approach is a little bit different. There is also kind of a ceiling or a cap, but it may or may not be attached to a trading. So basically, if you exceed your allocated emissions, you will just pay a tax, and that's it. In some cases, ETS and carbon tax can coexist in the same geography. For example, certain sectors like power sector can be a subject of carbon tax. You just pay a tax if you exceed certain emissions. At the same time, there may be an emission trading scheme that covers say manufacturing facilities, and they have a slightly different policy instrument that would regulate the market there. What is different as well is that in case of emission trading scheme, we know that the cap and the allocated emissions to the scheme, but we don't know the price. The price is actually dictated by the market. On the other hand side, in case of the carbon tax, the price is known because the price of the carbon tax is predefined by the government. But at the same time, we don't know how much actually the participants of the market will be emitting. In terms of their GHGs, they may choose not to reduce their emissions. They may choose to emit them, but just pay a tax. So this is also a drawback of the carbon tax mechanism. Another drawback of the carbon tax is that in some geographies, and in developing countries in particular, introducing additional tax may be seen as not a popular political move. So some countries deliberately try to escape calling it a carbon tax, and really either switch to emission trading scheme because of that, or just change the wording and legally do not call it a tax. So these are probably the main drawbacks or challenges of those schemes. As we can see globally, there are more than 65 carbon pricing initiatives existing at the moment, including emission trading schemes and carbon taxes. And you will see in some markets like Indonesia or Colombia, indeed there are two different schemes, either already existing or planned to be introduced. And typically, as we mentioned, that would cover different sectors. In some cases, carbon tax can also be attached to purchase of emissions. Say, for example, in Colombia, if there is a carbon tax in place for certain industries, but they are allowed to purchase carbon offsets from valid carbon market schemes. What is important here is that the number of carbon pricing instruments is growing fast every year. For example, in 2022, the new mechanism appeared in Indonesia. We'll talk about this later today. They have introduced already a carbon tax, and emission trading scheme is coming up. In Thailand, the government is also discussing carbon tax or emission trading scheme. It's not clear yet which form the carbon pricing will take in this market. Same for Vietnam. So very interesting dynamics. And obviously one of the greatest additions to the carbon pricing market globally was China, that just very recently introduced a countrywide emission trading scheme. Great. One more interesting mechanism that I wanted to mention before we move on to the next session is CORSIA, or Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. With the post-COVID a new era, when aviation is back again and we can travel more, this scheme is becoming more and more important. So this CORSIA scheme was actually introduced even before COVID, but with the piloting phase starting in 2021, it covers all major international companies in all countries uh, that have already voluntarily confirmed to be part of CORSIA would be subject to it, meaning that global aviation would need to also comply with certain greenhouse gas emission regulations and targets. And if they cannot reduce their emissions, they would need to purchase offsets from eligible carbon market instruments. And this is where Malaysia is also quite an interesting market, because on the one hand side, you have companies like Malaysian Airways or Air Asia, headquartered in Malaysia, and that would be subject to CORSIA. So they would need to comply with the scheme. But on the other hand side, Malaysia can also supply offsets for such schemes through your natural climate solution projects, for example. So Malaysia could be both uh, represent both supply and demand side of this interesting aviation offsetting market. We'll talk about this a little bit later as well, and especially if you have any questions on that, happy to answer. For the sake of time, let's move on. And in the next session, we'll talk about how carbon pricing can help achieve companies' climate targets. Great. One of the important uh, terms or definitions we need to understand is that the carbon markets can be divided into two large groups: compliance markets and voluntary markets. The main difference is that under compliance markets, the emission reductions are mandated, be it by the government at the national level, at the city level, or by the sectoral, like industrial groups. And good examples of that could be, for instance, European Union Emission Trading Scheme, which is a mandatory policy instrument introduced by European Union back in 2013. And actually, all companies that fall under emission trading scheme have mandatory carbon emission targets. And consequently, if they don't comply with those targets, then they need to be penalized. CORSIA is a good example of industrial, global, but industry specific scheme. It is voluntary at the beginning and in its first phase, but then going forward, it will become mandatory. So it's another example of compliance market in the future. And then there is a multitude of voluntary market schemes. Basically, companies or organizations voluntarily take climate or renewable energy targets under various frameworks like Science-Based Target Initiative, Carbon Neutral, Net Zero, RE100, etc. And then they participate in the carbon pricing schemes voluntarily. They're not obliged by their governments yet, but they are this way preparing for the future mandatory schemes, or to demonstrate their leadership, or to also satisfy their investors. The reasons can be multiple. But this is the main difference that we need to understand going forward, because the carbon markets will impact compliance market and voluntary market slightly differently. Next slide, please. Okay, another important concept is the carbon offsets and renewable energy certificates. So these are two principal instruments on the carbon markets that companies, organizations can use to compensate for their greenhouse gas emissions. Imagine that you have a target, be it mandatory or voluntarily set by your organization, and you cannot yet achieve it fully through your internal emission reduction measures. What to do? So there is a way out, is to offset those exceeding emissions through carbon offsets or renewable energy certificates. There are some differences between those two instruments. In case of carbon offsets, these are expressed in metric tons of CO2 or CO2 equivalent. And so basically, regardless of the greenhouse gas that is reduced or avoided through such projects, they are all then defined in CO2 equivalents. These projects can be of different forms and coming from different technologies and sectors, from renewable energy, waste management to low carbon transport, green buildings, or natural-based solutions. And they can offset organizations' emissions across all GHG scopes, direct emissions, scope 1, and indirect emissions, scope 2 and 3. RECs, or renewable energy certificates, in turn, are expressed in megawatt hours, not in CO2. However, they can be converted into CO2 as well, and they come only from renewable energy projects. And what is important, they can only offset scope 2 emissions related to purchased energy. Another important difference between carbon offsets and RECs that some of the most stringent climate standards, like for example, Science-Based Target Initiative and its the most recent Net Zero standard, allow only for limited offsetting through carbon offsets up to 5 to 10% of total emissions, whereas RECs can be unlimitedly purchased for scope 2 emissions compensation up to 100%. And this is an absolutely valid way of sourcing renewable energy, as if you are sourcing it from the actual renewable energy project. And it is also fully eligible under SBTI and many other, if not all, international frameworks. So this is the main difference. Next slide, please. Okay, so how can companies use offsets or renewable energy certificates to achieve climate targets? That would apply likewise to various industrial sector and financial organizations. So there are 5 principal steps. The first usual step is to understand your baseline emissions and to define the base year. Then the next step would be to actually understand what would be the business as usual projections between now and the target year, say 2030 on that slide, and what would be your potential emission reduction target by that target year. And then you would need to define how you can reduce your emissions between the base year and the target year. And there are several ways. The first and foremost, of course, is to reduce your emissions at your own operations or across your value chain, especially if we look into financial sector. For you, it would be very important to work with your investees or borrowers to help them reduce their emissions, because that would impact your scope 3 downstream emissions as well. But what if, especially now, you cannot achieve all your emission reductions? Say your investees are not ready, they need time to define their own strategies. You also may not have enough capacities or options. Technologies may be not there yet. So you can use offsets to compensate for such residual emissions. And as you can see on that slide, at the beginning, you may rely almost fully on the offsets. But going forward, their share in your journey will become less and less. And interestingly, you will see the gray bars on the chart. The light gray bars represent all kind of carbon offsets, regardless of the sector or type of project you will purchase it from. But what is important going forward, you would need to rely more and more on the carbon offsets coming from natural climate projects or from removal project types, which are increasingly prioritized by the global community and under a growing number of net zero standards. So there is kind of merit order uh, in terms of what kind of carbon projects or carbon offsets are better or worse. And in the current global discussions, removal project types related to natural projects are becoming more and more important and prioritized over everything else, except for renewable energy certificates that we have discussed on the previous slide. Great. Let's move on to the next slide. And another important concept I wanted to explain to you is the difference between carbon neutrality and net zero. Until recently, carbon neutrality was the most common terminology used globally. Net zero appeared, I would say, mostly last year in before the COP26. And actually, in the COP26 decision, it was somewhat included by the countries, meaning that nowadays we have a big shift from in our thinking from carbon neutrality towards net zero, and net zero is becoming the global target by 2050. So what's the difference? The main difference is that for carbon neutrality, you can really purchase all kind of offsets and as much as you want to claim your carbon neutrality status. Say we see companies on the market who can purchase up to 100% of offsets to compensate for their emissions and claim being carbon neutral, which is a valid way. They have the right to do that. But in reality, they do not reduce their own emissions. They just help projects somewhere else to do that instead of their own efforts. That is why globally there is a big shift to the concept of net zero, because under net zero, it is supposed that the own emission reductions are prioritized, and then only residual emissions would be offset. And again, priority would be given to only natural climate solutions or removal project types. So in a way, net zero is much more stringent, much more encouraging in terms of own emission reductions, and very supportive for carbon projects that have lots of additional sustainability benefits. Nevertheless, carbon neutrality is being widely used not for companies anymore, but more for individual products or services, say carbon neutral LNG, carbon neutral oil, or carbon neutral flights. So those offsets are linked rather than to organizational inventory, but to specific products. And as we mentioned before, Scope 2 emissions and renewable energy certificate are valid under both schemes, and actually under net zero, they can be used to compensate up to 100% of Scope 2 emissions. Let's move on and see on the next slide this merit order that I have mentioned before. So previously, well, before Paris Agreement, let's say, all kind of emission reduction or avoidance projects were there under CDM mechanism in renewable energy, transportation, waste management, natural climate solutions. They all had, if not equal weight and not equal price, but at least they were all in demand. Let's put it this way. But these days, with the growing number of standards and frameworks pushing companies and organizations towards net zero and carbon removal, offsetting through carbon removal, we will see a great shift towards green type of projects, aiming at carbon removal rather than just avoidance of emissions. And renewable energy technologies are shifting from the carbon market completely to renewable energy certificate schemes. So these are two big trends that we see globally in the carbon pricing market. And let's maybe have a look at a couple of examples. Well, before then, just very last concept. That is also quite interesting, the difference between offsetting and insetting. A lot of clients ask us about this. So carbon offsetting, if you purchase offsets from elsewhere, from a project that can be implemented anywhere in the world by any other organization, say you are located in Malaysia, you want to compensate for your emissions, and you buy offsets from a project in Africa that is aimed at, say, biogas cook stoves. say in Gambia. Insetting, in turn, is when you purchase offsets from projects along your value chain. It can be, for example, a project implemented by your investee or by your supplier, or within basically within your overall value chain and the boundaries of your organization. All right, now a couple of case studies. This was a project we actually helped deliver a global climate fund, a financial organization, and their investee, which is a solar energy developer. And that was a regional study where we looked into how this financial sector uh, player, as well as the solar developer, can benefit from participating in the carbon markets and renewable energy certificate markets in South and Southeast Asia. It was a very interesting study with good regional overview, which countries are more interesting, which are less, and which kind of instruments to undertake in each specific market. And another example is on the other hand side. So this, the first project was more related to supply side of carbon credits or RECs. This is another example from the demand side. So that was a global automotive producer from Asia region with operations in Malaysia. And they actually wanted to see how they can purchase carbon offsets or renewable energy certificates to compensate for the scope 1 to 3 emissions, and in particular in Malaysia as well. And we did a study, but focusing more on the demand side, so where they can purchase carbon credits or RECs in Malaysia, from which project types and from which suppliers. All right. A quick pause, and I will lastly explain you a little bit on the current and upcoming carbon pricing regulations in ASEAN before Chin later on will explain what's happening in Malaysia. Right. And the first table we wanted to introduce to you are key markets that may be relevant to yourselves and to Malaysia. First and foremost, we always talk about European Union. The reason is because European Union was amongst the first markets globally that has introduced carbon pricing as the mandatory policy. Remember the compliance market. So they have emission trading scheme since 2013. And you can see that currently the price is quite high, on average about 27.8 US dollars per ton of CO2. They don't have a carbon tax, but what they are introducing from next year, it is called Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. And this is particularly important not for EU, but for companies that produce goods that will be exported to the European Union. Basically, if such goods do not meet the EU carbon requirements, they would need to pay a tax. That's why it's called cross-border tax. So it's another form of carbon tax, but the subject of this tax will be not the companies in EU, but companies outside of EU supplying products to EU. So that's definitely something Malaysia organizations would need to look at. China is another big market. I mentioned that was one of the most recent additions globally. Back in 2021, it introduced national emission trading scheme, and that's pretty much a scheme to look at in terms of the size, the scope, and a lot of good lessons learned for other markets like Malaysia. Closer to us in our region, we have carbon pricing instruments already in Singapore and Indonesia. In Singapore, there is a carbon tax. In Indonesia as well, starting from July this year, actually. An emission trading scheme is also being introduced. Thailand doesn't have yet any mandatory policy instrument, neither carbon tax nor carbon trading. But there is a voluntary scheme called TIVR, which is more voluntary as in nature, as I mentioned, but it is more to support early starters, those who develop low carbon projects and would like to sell the carbon credits on the market. Let's maybe have a quick look at each of them, Thailand, Singapore, and Indonesia, and then I will pass it to Tirapon for internal carbon pricing. Okay, so Singapore has had the carbon tax in place since 2019. Currently, it's at $5 per ton of CO2. But what is great about this policy instrument is that Singapore is being very transparent in terms of the future pricing. And as you can see here, the price will increase over time progressively. So investors who aim at products or companies in Singapore can integrate this carbon pricing into their decisions already now. Um, Next, please. In Thailand, I mentioned there is no mandatory scheme yet. There is only voluntary Thailand uh, scheme called TIVR. Uh, in principle, it's offsetting scheme. So basically, it's just a scheme where you can certify low carbon projects and issue carbon offsets from such projects according to the nationally adopted standards. As you can see here, there are about 200 projects registered under TIVR, and it's a very eligible scheme in Thailand. And I know that a lot of corporates, for instance, are looking for TIVR certificates to offset their carbon emissions. In addition, TIVR, the national organization called TGO, Thailand Greenhouse Gas Management Organization, supports labeling, like carbon neutrality labeling for organizations, including through purchase of such TIVR offsets. Next. Indonesia. As I mentioned, Indonesia has just recently introduced a carbon tax. It will be in place since July 2022. And at first, it will cover only coal-based power sector. However, the initiative will then later expand to other carbon-intensive sectors, including manufacturing. In addition, the country is also aiming to introduce emission trading scheme and the national carbon offsetting mechanism similar to TIVR in Thailand. So that's definitely a very interesting market to look at because it will be probably the first in our region to introduce both ETS and carbon tax as well as offsetting scheme. So for Malaysia, it would be a very good peer example going forward. All right, with that said, I will pass it on to Tirapon for internal carbon pricing. And if you have any questions on my part, please feel free to post them in the chat. I'm happy to start picking them up and writing.
Thank you so much, Julia. So for internal carbon pricing, this is sort of the opposite in some ways of what we've been hearing about the regulatory carbon price. So the regulatory carbon price is a price that is set by the government to incentivize companies to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And for those companies that do not want to reduce their emissions for one reason or another, then at least it is a way of raising funds, raising revenue, and that revenue could be used recycled, used for other purposes to such as greenhouse gas reduction projects and renewable energy. Internal carbon pricing, from its name, maybe you can guess that it's actually for companies specifically. This is not something that governments use. This is something more on a company level that companies use, and it is mostly a response to the regulatory carbon pricing. And could be a response, for example, in ahead of an announcement of a carbon pricing regime within a country, where the company wants to see and make sure that if there is a carbon price, that they can see what the impacts are, and they can ensure that their business is resilient to that carbon price. And specifically, carbon pricing is most useful for companies that produce a lot of emissions, heavy industries. So when we're talking about funds, then when you're thinking about the carbon price, you're not going to be thinking about it on yourselves. You may have an office, you may have some employees. That may be the extent of your operations, but where the greenhouse gas really lays, it will be in the companies that are in your funds, and then it would be up to you to make a decision on what carbon pricing that should be placed on companies that are within your funds. Of course, this is also relevant to other parts of finance sector, such as banking, where banks are making loans to maybe high uh, uh, companies that produce lots of carbon, and they want to make sure that if the carbon price increases in the future, that there is no credit risk to them. There's no risk of default. That whatever asset that they're lending to would still be able to make the repayments of the loans. So this is overall on internal carbon pricing, and basically each company is free to make a decision on how they want to use the carbon pricing. On this part, I'll just go quickly, but mostly for your guidance, and there are great documents out there. One of them is this guide to corporate internal carbon pricing by CDP. It's a few years old, but it is still very relevant for this time and age. The recommended steps to firstly to have engagement within your organization, to get your managers and executives involved, and have them have buy-in on why we need the internal carbon pricing. Then it would be designing the internal carbon pricing approach fit for your company. And then rolling out the approach. You may have a pilot project, or you may just have a rollout. And the internal carbon price is a living and breathing thing. Just as the regulatory carbon prices do rise and fall. For cap and trade, it would depend on the market. For carbon tax, it would depend on the government's decision on raising the carbon price. And the same for the company, you would need to continually uh, uh, view the landscape in terms of how what the regulatory landscape is and how that would affect you. So those are the four steps, and then in terms of the uh, parts of the carbon price, of course, one of the most important is the actual price itself, which we'll explain in a bit how about that price. In terms of the business influence, will it be for all of your business or only for parts of it? Um, how much greenhouse gas does it cover? So, for example, there could be scopes 1 and 2, which are your direct emissions, but for funds, then more importantly would be the scope 3 or on your your managed assets. And then, of course, over time, as I mentioned, carbon pricing could change over time. So there should be some internal processes in place for this. Of course, one thing maybe I didn't emphasize, but of course, needs someone to be responsible for the internal carbon pricing. This could be an additional role, or maybe a new role that is related to other aspects that are related to sustainable financing as well. But definitely someone either existing will need to have this additional role to look at the carbon price, or maybe someone new. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, so these are just some of the benefits. I think the main one for funds is de-risking against future carbon price, as mentioned previously. So if you think of a carbon price as zero right now and in the future as well, that's not accurately reflecting what that price could be, because in the future, definitely once the future regulations comes in place, it's just a matter of time. We don't know exactly when that would be, but from the trends in this region, we can see that it's starting to come. So having that analysis, looking at within your funds, if the companies within your funds did have to pay a carbon price, then how would that affect their financials and the overall performance of the fund, for example? Could be around future proofing your business strategy. And then something that a lot of our clients get a lot is questions from investors asking or even consumers, customers asking what companies are doing in terms of the internal carbon pricing, and then having that strategy in place and something to answer the investors to make the investors sure that you are managing your carbon risks properly. But of course, there are also many other benefits as shown in the slide. Okay, this is also just some additional guidance. I would like to ask to skip it for now. But of course, the source that we used here is Business Leadership Criteria on Carbon Pricing, which is another important guidance on carbon pricing. And the idea of trying to reduce emissions to a level of 1.5 degrees Celsius um, as per the Paris agreements. So maybe we could just recap again in terms of the carbon pricing and what it means for the companies. So in the top picture, in this example, the government implements a carbon price. We aren't talking about whether it's cap and trade or not. That doesn't really matter. What matters is the 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 carbon price is implemented. The company itself produces emissions, and then it pays that price back to the government, and that money, as I mentioned previously, will then be reinvested in renewable energy and other green technologies to help to reduce emissions. Also, because of carbon pricing, then of course that affects the value chain. So the price of products for that company will rise, and that will also have a trickle down effect in terms of the spending and overall. Uh, then it would make the prices for that commodity more expensive, and consumers can choose other routes. So, with this being said, the main things that the company is thinking about is how do we reduce this amount of payment that we need to make to the government, um, and what is the cost of how much does it actually cost for us to reduce emissions, and then is the final decision making a financial analysis. Is it cheaper to just pay the government, or is it more price-worthy to invest in some greenhouse gas reductions, which could have cost reduction, for example, if you're reducing energy. And so that's a decision for the company to make. And one of the metrics, of course, is the carbon price, of course, that would go into the calculations there. Okay, so this is just the recapping in terms of what the regulatory carbon price means, and then as I showed in the previous slide, maybe starting to think about from the company's viewpoint, why would they want to think about internal carbon price? And it's mostly about how to plan and how to react to the regulatory carbon price and that sort of thing. So in terms of internal carbon pricing, so this is a survey of companies across the globe, and I think for this slide doesn't really show much other than actually one thing it does show is that between Europe and North America, where the number of companies are probably comparable. Europe has greater has a greater influence from stakeholders and government. So these are the number of companies actually that internal carbon pricing. So and within 2019, within Europe, it's almost double of North America, where North America, in the time of Trump, before Biden had come, there was not a strong emphasis on the regulation, but nevertheless, a lot of companies were proactive, or the international companies, so that they needed the internal carbon pricing. And of course, in Asia, there's a great rise. I think if we had to split down, then we would see that a lot of companies could be Chinese, because in China there is a pilot emissions trading program in place, and of course more and more interest there. So just to show that the interest is rising, I wouldn't say that this is, if we show this as percentage, it might still be a small percentage of total companies in each area, but we could see that the trend is that it's rising and that more and more companies are setting an internal carbon price. Next, please. Um, yes, I think there's one. Yes, let's just move on. Um, So in terms of the carbon pricing approach and what we think that is most appropriate for investment funds or any other sort of financial based institution would be what we call a shadow price. Um, and then the ones on the left and the right, internal tax fee and cap, as well as implicit carbon price, is more about improving the company's greenhouse gas reduction measures. So if those are something that is important to the fund, then those can be used. But I believe that for the funds, as I mentioned, your main operations would be your head office. You may have a few employees. Your overall emissions would not be so large. So I will briefly explain what internal tax and fee and implicit carbon price are so that you can understand and maybe understand how they could be important for companies within your funds. But I will focus on shadow price. So maybe I'll start with internal tax and implicit carbon price. And internal tax is basically like it's basically like an emissions trading scheme, but on a company level. So for example, Microsoft, for each of their business units, they have a target to not produce any emissions over that target. If they do produce emissions over that target, then they will have to pay a fee. It's an internal fund. It's all recycled back into the Microsoft anyway, but the fund is specifically only for renewable energy and greenhouse gas reduction initiatives. So that's one idea in terms of internal tax. In terms of implicit carbon price, so you could have companies within your portfolio that want to understand how much does it cost for them to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and this can be based on past initiatives. And this, once they do calculate this number, it would be basically a benchmark. Any future activities would need to be more cost effective than the ones that they have currently. And finally is in terms of shadow price. So this is usually applied upon expectations of a rising regulatory carbon pricing in the future, but can also be any other theoretical internal cost of carbon that is applied, for example, for project planning purposes and other purposes. Specifically for funds, this would be, you could, for example, ask for information from the companies that you're investing in, and ask them what their emissions are for scopes 1 and 2. And then from your research, you can see that, let's say the carbon price is $20. So you can have a high-level estimation of what they would need to be paying in terms of carbon tax or cap and trade right now, as well as if they have any actual information on what they have paid. And then for future emissions of those in your fund, you can see the trend in their rising costs as the carbon price increases over time. So the different standards such as IEA, World Energy Outlook will have reference in terms of what they expect the future carbon price to be. But of course, internally within your company, you can also develop those estimations or those scenarios of what the carbon price could be if you have the sufficient information on hand. And all of this will feed back to you in terms of the cost to the company and will help you to better understand the financials. As I mentioned, would suggest not applying carbon cost of zero. It is going to occur sometime in the future, and then that will help you to see the cost structure of the companies that you have, whether that would have any impact on any significant impact on the profit. And then once you do have this analysis and numbers, it could be something that you can then discuss with the companies within your fund. So I think we have some additional examples here. I think for now, just to say that, of course, the range of prices, it really depends on you, it depends on the company. and what you view the risk of the carbon price to be, what you view the future price to be. Um, and since I am really focusing on the shadow price, I won't go through the benefits and challenges of both. I'll just look at the shadow price specifically. So the benefits is that you help to improve or determine the resilience of your investments, and then you can improve them by engaging with those companies within your fund. Um, However, if a price is too low, you set a price too low, then it may not make any change in terms of the shift in investment. And another challenge, of course, is a theoretical number. So it's something that needs to be agreed on internally, as well as how you would use that. Since it is a theoretical number, how far would it go to influence your financials and your business strategy? Yep.
Chang,
Yes.
we are quite running out of
Yes, I
time.
know. I know.
You can wrap up. Yeah.
Yes, I think we can skip these. So we have some examples and some resources such as CDP that you can look at the responses from other companies. But really, for the key takeaways is that it's not too late to start. This is an emerging trend. I think stakeholders, investors do understand that this is something that's developing in this region, and that we may not be as advanced as our European or US peers in this, but important starting points is to start talking about carbon pricing, at least to see what your management thinks about it, maybe to show them some case studies that carbon pricing is starting to be in place, and also thinking about the greenhouse gas reduction targets, which the carbon pricing could help to drive. And looking at internal measures. And then, as mentioned previously, so separate to the internal carbon pricing part, there are things such as renewable energy certificates. So I understand, as I mentioned, so most of your emissions, your direct emissions, from scope 2 would be from electricity. Purchasing renewable electricity would help you on your net zero journey, and offsetting using nature-based solutions is also another way. Another part is in terms of carbon credits. So if you do produce your own carbon credits, they could be sold as well. So you would have that benefit. But the purpose of carbon credits is mostly to either if you are spending money on carbon credits, is to help the communities that are finding ways to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and helping to fund their efforts. But in a way, it would not help in terms of the overall final net zero target. And as finally, as I already mentioned on previous slides, there are three main types of carbon pricing. Actually, there are more. It really depends on the purpose, but these are the three main ones: internal tax, shadow price, and implicit carbon price. And we really do recommend that for your sector, that shadow price is the most relevant one, that can be applied to companies within your fund. And something I may not have mentioned can also be applied also to your own operations, but we understand that the majority of impacts will be in terms of the fund. And in line with TCFD, the thinking is to for all financial related companies to understand their risks, to have reports from the companies within the fund, also providing them with information based on the climate change risks, so that you can make a better decision in terms of how you manage your fund, how you engage with your fund companies. So thank you. Chin?
Yep. Thank you, Chirapon. We will move on to deep dive into carbon pricing, the context in Malaysia. Very quickly, I want to share with you, Malaysia is the fourth largest carbon dioxide emitter in ASEAN countries. So if you look at this graph, there are about 240 million tons of carbon dioxide released in 2018. So if you look at the red line, which is pointed with a legend, it mentions that in the initial year 2005, we have an increase of about 11% per year. And after that, we have reduced to about 6.5% per year in the year of 2000. And recently in 2019, right, we have further reduced to 3% per year. So hopefully in the near future, we will achieve our national target, that is to reduce the greenhouse gases intensity of GDP by 45% by 2030, relative to the year that we have set on 2005. So this is the overall target. So with the note that 35% is unconditional, and 10% will be conditional to financing and also technology transfer by developed countries. Yeah. Next slide, please. So we will look into the local market here, what was being announced, end of last year in the 12th Malaysia plan. We mentioned about that we will create a domestic emission trading system. So this is what we call the DETS. Yeah, the interaction between the market supply and the demand will determine the carbon price in the future, like what other markets are having. There is a fixed cap on the greenhouse gases permitted for each business as well. And the other mechanism that we will be implementing is what Yulia has mentioned just now on carbon border adjustment mechanism, the cross-border tax, to EU country, the CBAM. We will share the slide pack with you so that you can have a more understanding and deeper understanding of the context here. So there are two standards available as of now in Malaysia. This is what we call the VCS program and the gold standard. So VCS program is the world's most widely applicable, voluntarily greenhouse gases program, while the gold standard, this can be purchased carbon credit from the project certified through their website, right? So there are these two that are available in Malaysia as of current. Next slide. And talking about renewables certificate on the electrical side, there are three types of clean renewable energy certificates available in Malaysia. In short, we call it the IREC program and TIGRS and GETS program. So they were all launched back then in 2018 and 2019, mostly from solar energy generation systems. And that there are quotas as well under this program. So we can have a lot of, you can see the price of credit, $1 to $2 kilowatt per hour. And for MGETS, it's being issued by TNBX, Sdn Mahat, and then the price is to be determined. Right. Next slide. This is to show you a very clear pathway how to use the credit and RECs in Malaysia. So ERN has done some assessment, and it's as of now we have quite a slow carbon or REC markets due to the past or ongoing net metering policy. The government has introduced the net energy metering scheme back then in 2016, that there are quotas like what I have mentioned just now, 500 megawatt up to the year 2020. So this is to encourage Malaysian renewable energy take up, and we would like to increase that from year to year, and especially by 2030, there is a target for us to achieve for the mixed blend of renewable energy that we want to Malaysia to achieve. Right? Due to the solar project owner can already sell electricity to the grid, so we see that there is relatively less incentive for solar developer and the RECs buyer to sell and buy RECs, right? So they can directly tap back to the grid. So REC certificate is exhausted fast, and quota was set, right? So industrial will need to pay attention for the new scheme and the new launch. Next slide. These are the four types of player, right, for the Malaysia market. So we can categorize them into project developer, EAC issuers, the company entity that gives guidelines, authorization, right? And there are also the intermediaries broker, like EcoIdeal in this place, and also the credit purchaser. So these are the middle person who is helping and developing the market in Malaysia. Next slide. Overall, carbon pricing is currently in the early stage of implementation. Malaysia government has talked about it, has some plans about it, but it is expected in the next few years. Once carbon pricing mechanism is formalized, then we will see these changes, yeah, in Malaysia market. So the future outlook is if companies already have solar projects with off-takers in Malaysia and MGAPs become available to private sector project developers for participation, this may present a quick win opportunity for a lot of the investor and who step into RE, renewable energy, right? So as for the low carbon economy transition, there are signals intention with carbon pricing to be used as a tool. So this is no doubt is already a reality. Yeah, carbon pricing rollout estimated to be timeline based, and on other countries we have seen in the region and discussed earlier in the presentation. Singapore is one of the leader. Yeah, there are even some set up already in Indonesia as well. Right. The key challenges for us moving on is we need to remember that other pillars of sustainability outside of environmental are social and economic, and also the carbon leakages, what we talk about the CPAM measures on transboundary taxes and so on, cannot only affect Malaysia's economy, but reduces job opportunity. So all pillars here that we have seen in this slide are sustainability intrinsically linked, right? We talk about economy, social, and environment together, right? They are linked. There is a human and element in it, and be mindful that we need to manage all these key challenges ourselves. So there must be a clear strategy for us to move forward to assist the business and the people, right? As well as yourself, investors. Yeah, carbon taxes may lead us to rising costs, especially we see fuel costs, or we pass down to consumer, and then inflation and our living standards or living cost increases. So in our country, we are in a developing country, so we are still suffering from the impacts of pandemic, and we need to grow from there steadily. Yeah, not everybody can afford and pay or effects of carbon tax implemented later. So what are the measures moving forward? There are a few cases in Malaysia, that the case studies that I'll be sharing with you very quickly. This is a nature climate solutions project in Malaysia. So this is a tangible baseline carbon value at the Kota Damansara Community Forest. So it's a carbon stock. Yeah, the forest sequestered CO2. Yeah, this is ERM has provided a recommendation to increase the amount of carbon that can be stored in this community forest, and through proper management, hopefully we can achieve, and together with the community around, not only the carbon, but the economy, the environmental, and the social benefit for longer term. Right. Next slide, please. This is another case study, right? International Congress for Conservation in Biology was held back then in 2019, right? So this is a green project that we partner with the South Pole to SCB partner with the South Pole to help participants to offset their travel, right? Offset their travel footprint. Yeah, the project was selected, and this is what we call the Borneo Forestry Project in Malaysia back then. Yeah. this is my last slide on what are the key takeaways. Sorry for we ran it like a bit over time. Carbon pricing for companies in Malaysia. What are the key lessons that we have here, right? We mentioned our minister mentioned during the 12 Malaysia plan, and this is one of the way to enhance the capacity of industry player in producing products and services that are competitive at the international level, right? So as part of the plan, the signal of the arrival of carbon tax in Malaysia, however, I know Bursa, some of our participants here already preparing and then having a lot of case studies, comparing ourselves in Malaysia with other more advanced countries. So, however, no formal carbon tax framework yet for now, right? We foresee it will be coming very soon. Yeah, companies should stay updated on future plans and to allow private power producers to participate in the MRECs, for example, for local buyers to have more options. Currently accept larger scale of solar project that's allowed by TNB, UITM, Polar Solar, Power Solar projects. Yeah. Other than that, it is recommended to follow on updates. Yeah, to understand whether the scheme could be applicable to project that we incline or we are going to take on. What are the procedures and what types of registration are required for us to be up to date and meet the requirements. Yeah, for investors and companies in Malaysia, we need to evaluate whether they would like to, you would like to keep credits within ourselves, right? The project itself or towards the own of net zero climate targets before we like to sell them externally, right? Whether it's for our own use or for the future market exchange. So as these emission reductions and removal will not be counted towards targets. And then internationally, the carbon trading will be more regulated. Yeah, the regulations are evolving and then getting more stringent and more advanced, right? So we still go back to our national development commitment and targets. Yeah, we would like to reduce 45%, right? Based on the base year 2005. So this is yet to be seen on how this is to be operationalized. We are there, but still need a lot of effort, right? To move on to this direction. Yeah. With that, I pass back to Hugh, Alex. Hopefully, we can have one or two questions before we actually wrap up. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks so much, Yulia and Chin, and yeah, for your presentation. It was very informative, and there was a lot of insight into the developments in this region, worldwide as well as in Malaysia. Yeah, a number of our participants needed to leave early because of other meetings. They were asking whether they could have the recording of this event as well as your slide presentations. Would that be okay?
Yeah, we'll share it after I've done some housekeeping on it. Yeah, I'll definitely share with you, Alex. Yeah, you can contribute.
Yeah. Now, the participants over here, if you have any questions, could you please raise your hands and let us know if you have, so that we can have this Q&A in a bit more orderly fashion. Anyone here with any questions? Or if you want, you can actually just type into the chat box.
Hi, can we have a copy of the slides?
Yes. Will be distributed, yeah, through Alex.
Okay. We have Encik Baslan Osman. He has raised his hand. Encik Baslan, would you like to unmute yourself and ask?
Yes. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Fong. Thank you, Yulia, and thank you, Telepon. this is about the carbon tax. I think Fong mentioned just now that the government of Malaysia maybe still evaluating on the carbon tax. But learning from Singapore, Indonesia, they have this imposed the carbon tax for a couple of years, I believe. So, how do they reinvest, the tax that they obtain, from the companies? Do they put back in terms of the managing the environment? I believe that should be the case. I think it will be good if the carbon tax that will also manage the market or the corporates, because the carbon tax is being used to reinvest, for ESG, for environment, in order to achieve the carbon neutral by 2050. And secondly, the carbon tax that the government obtained can also be used to support the SMEs. Because as you know, to invest in ESG, there's a resources funding required, kan? So that the tax can be used to support the SMEs, because SMEs support, they are suppliers. We're talking about the supply chain. They are the suppliers to the large companies. So the large companies, of course, they will support the supply chain, the SMEs that provide the materials, the whatever required for the large companies to operate. And at the same time, the government can also provide certain incentive. I think that's my comment basically on the reinvesting or reinvestment of the tax that's been collected to support the local, the small companies. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Encik Baslan, for your comment. This is a statement. Ideally, government or ministry should be able to rechannel back the tax collected to enhance and support the SME and also green technology transfer within the country itself. So this is ideal. Again, the transparency of it, some of the country did announce what the program, right, moving forward. So we hope that we can follow those advanced countries in terms of this transition. This is very important. Investors and also some fund support, right, to make this a reality.
Yeah, maybe Yulia or Tirapon can comment whether the EU countries or Singapore or Indonesia, whether do they actually publicize with respect to the investment, or where they put back the tax collected, for the purpose of supporting the local industry and, of course, the environment as well of their respective countries.
Yeah, definitely. It depends on how the carbon pricing instrument is set. Typically, the governments would use, if not all the proceeds, some share to support further climate change actions. That could be actually investment in research and development. It could be climate adaptation projects, something that is not yet commercially viable but would need governmental support. That's the most common way about it. We have not checked in particular EU and Singaporean policies, but we can definitely look into that and get back to you later.
Thank you.
Just to add one point. So from EU two context. Sorry, this is Pralab again from ERM. In EU, two areas that they have which we are aware of. So one is sustainable aviation fuel. So they are providing subsidies for aviation industry to procure sustainable aviation fuel to both. So the subsidies are provided to both producers and procurers. And the second area that EU as well as US is focusing on is development of carbon transportation. So any captured carbon that needs to be transported and stored. So government is providing some tax rebates to the companies who are in this field. So those two areas we have looked at. There are definitely certainly some other policies which we haven't done a comprehensive analysis, but yeah, just to give you a hint as to how they are using, at least in EU and US. Thanks.
Thank you, Pranav.
Hi, Alex, can't hear you.
Unless
Thanks
you're
very, oh,
muted.
sorry. Okay. Sorry. Thanks very much, Dato' Bastan, for the questions. We also have Lim Chin Han, who has raised her hand. Chin Han,
Yeah.
would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, I would like to understand more about this carbon neutrality. And I'm hearing from the panelists, is not the same thing as net zero. So how do we effectively measure, carbon neutrality? Because Malaysia is, targeting to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. What does that mean? From what I gather, it's not exactly, we are going to be net zero. So we will still be emitting some carbon, CHG. But so how does that help us, in terms of managing climate change?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And actually, now after this session, hopefully you will be more attentive to companies and even countries' ambition levels. So definitely, carbon neutrality is not as ambitious as net zero. And the way out would be, of course, for any residual emissions that the country cannot reduce within the identified sectors, it will be offset, say, through natural climate solutions, basically investing into forestation projects or agricultural projects that would help remove carbon. Yep, I believe that would be the main way out.
But how do you measure it? I mean, like, how much carbon reduction, is good enough to consider ourselves carbon neutral?
Oh, definitely. I mean, there are frameworks for that. At the national level, it is usually done through a national GHG inventory. So every certain number of years, countries would need to submit their national inventories to the UNFCCC Secretariat, which would include their GHG emissions as well as emission reduction and removal efforts. And in the end of the day, they need to be balanced out to be able to claim carbon neutrality by certain year. So for companies, there are certain frameworks like GHG protocol, for example, under which organizations also submit their greenhouse gas emission inventories, but at the organizational level. There are also frameworks like carbon neutrality, for example, carbon neutral protocol, where you can also certify your carbon neutrality achieved, for example. I hope that answers your
Yeah.
question.
Not really, because it doesn't really tell me, like, what level of reduction, would you then be considered to be carbon neutral, because you will still be emitting some carbon,
Yes,
it's not net zero.
yes.
So how do you determine whether you are carbon neutral?
Well, let's
By
say if out of 100% of your total emissions, you reduce 30% and 70 is remaining, then you would need to offset 70% to be able to claim carbon neutrality.
I see. So you do that by, like, for instance, buying carbon credits and
Yes,
so on. Okay,
correct.
thanks.
Sorry.
Alex, you are muted.
Yeah, we have a
Yeah,
question
mute.
from, sorry, we have a question from Carol. Which industries are the biggest emitters of carbon dioxide in Malaysia?
If I'm not mistaken, the first will be from the energy sector, fossil fuel sector. We call it energy, including oil and gas as well. The second will be on the traffic, right? The transportation logistic that we have. These are the two key major one in Malaysia. Yeah.
Okay, are there any further questions? Perhaps I just one question from my side. One is that how do you see the political will in Malaysia moving towards this carbon pricing mechanism? I mean, it looks like it's going to add to the cost of the companies, and we are still, as what you mentioned earlier, we are still struggling through the COVID-19 pandemic, and also going through an election cycle now. I'm just wondering what would you say is your Malaysia's will and the companies in Malaysia in moving towards this based on your interactions with them so far?
A lot of the companies are being pressured to actually look into this aspect, although they say, oh, I'm just a local company, but Malaysia, we do export a major of our production and services to overseas as well. So therefore, as a supplier supporting the world supply chain, right, we also need to comply with some of the requirements in terms of the low carbon transition activities. Yeah, overall in Malaysia, we do have like carbon neutrality, net zero targets being set by companies. But at the end, within the country itself, in terms of the policies and a lot of the smaller chunk of the initiative will need to be spelled out more clearly so that industry will have more guidance and firm to move on with their programs and the transition effort. This is my point of view at this moment. Yeah.
Okay, great. Any last questions from the floor? Otherwise, we have already moved past more than 25 minutes past our schedule. But I think everyone is interested in your slide because there's a lot of information in it, which I think they would like to take some time to look through, because so many things was being discussed just now, and I don't think all of us are able to absorb everything there as well. So yeah. So again, on behalf of M Investment Bank and Bursa Malaysia, I would like to thank Bonnie, Tirapon, as well as Yulia for taking the time to provide us with this invaluable insights, right, on the climate change and sustainability initiatives that is being done, across the world and also in this part of Asia. So thank you very much, and we hope we can have some form of further participation if some clients also wish to have a bit more in-depth discussions regarding some of the solutions that you provide as well. All right. So
thank you. And yeah, thank you, Alex. Thank you, and Investment Bank, and to all the participants today. Thank you for your time. We will be sharing the slide pack and the video shortly. We do have our contacts in the last page of that slides. So please do contact us if you need any more explanation or any support. Yeah, so we can help you in your journey forward in the low carbon transition.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.